Okay, hey again, everybody. Happy Friday. So, I'm going to talk about the story a little bit, and I'm going to show you a couple of things that came out in the story. Then I'm going to talk about your comprehension questions, which are due next week, Tuesday. And I will be giving you some time on Monday to work on those, just so you know. So you'll have time to work on those on Monday, and they're due on Tuesday. So that just wanted to give you that plan. So now, if you remember, we talked about in your Holy Book of Writing, we talked about one of the figurative languages. One of the things that authors will do, I should say, is they will use allusion. And that is, remember, I have mine open up right here. My Holy Book of Writing is opened up to allusion. And allusion, remember, is a reference to a person, to a place, an event from literature, from sports, from history, from movies, arts. So usually a reference to somebody or something that you would recognize. Now, we learned when we talked about allusion that the allusion works as long as you, the reader, have prior knowledge of what's being referenced to. So I don't know how many of you have seen of course, this story was a story. The Last Dog is a story about a dog. And I don't know if any of you have seen an old movie called Old Yeller. And some of you right now are going, oh, yeah, I've seen that movie. And it's extremely sad, by the way, but very good movie. And it's about a boy, a couple of boys, and they fall in love with a dog that they find. And so, again, it's sort of like The Last Dog because they find this dog and they name the dog Old Yeller and fall in love with this dog very deeply, and there's a reference, there's an allusion to that. Now this allusion works if you know the story. If you don't know the story, it won't work for you, but it'll work for a lot of people because Old Yeller was a very popular book. So this is paragraph 70, and partway through paragraph 70, this is when Brock, you can see the beginning, Brock was living with Brog in the research center and spending all this time with him. Further down the page, it says here that Brock was tempted to speak sharply to her, that's the dog Brog, even when there was no need. For the sight of her drooping ears and tail, her mournful eyes, was so dear to him that he did, instead, what Travis Coates did, which is Travis Coates is a character from the movie Old Yeller. What Travis Coates had done to Old Yeller right here. He hugged her. And so for me, having seen that movie, I can picture that scene and I can then picture what Brock is doing with, and even the emotions that Brock has for Brog, this dog. And that's why an author will use, allusions here. Now, this is one, I'm going to go backwards. There are a few different mini allusions, I could call them. That was probably the strongest allusion right here. And it's Old Yeller right here. So if I grab my pen and you can see, well, actually, I can highlight that, I think. See if I do that. Yeah, there's Old Yeller right there. So now you can see it refers to that movie. Now, if you haven't seen that movie, check it out. I think it's on probably Disney streaming. I'm not sure, but so now let me go back up to paragraph 32. As I mentioned, there's sort of like a lot of mini allusions in this. So I think it's in paragraph 32. I'm going to go, and again, see, I'm on the digital copy, so this is what you can do with your digital copy. And okay, so here it is. This is when Brock was saying, he had never seen a dog before. He'd been inside this dome. He had never seen a dog, of course, but he'd seen plenty of breed descriptions on the science, and I'm hiding like that. Show you where I'm at. On the science history virtuals, dogs had been abundant once. They filled the ancient fictions, the ancient books and such. They even had names there, names like Lassie, Toto, and Sounder. I imagine Toto because all my classes yesterday had heard of Toto, and that's right. Toto comes from the Wizard of Oz. Some of you, probably not, might know Lassie. Lassie was a very popular on a very popular show, and Lassie was a dog who was the star of the show. And he many a time rescued people from dangerous situations. Lassie was an amazing dog. I always wanted a Lassie dog. And then Sounder was another very famous story. about a dog as well. But you guys probably recognize Toto, and that author is throwing that out there because the author, or she in this case, knows that you're going to recognize some of these names of dogs. So again, that's kind of like a mini illusion, and the author does that a couple of times, kind of throwing out names that you might recognize. And again, the illusions don't work if you don't have that prior knowledge. But in this case, you guys probably have heard of Toto. Now I'm going to switch into something else. Remember, your comprehension is going to be due on Monday. So I'm going to go to my homepage, my agenda, show you a couple of things here. So this is Friday. You've done this stuff on the top here, and here's your homework, the last dog comprehension. And there's worksheets on this for, as I've said before, if you click here, this is the worksheet for first and fifth, and these are the worksheets for second and sixth. So if you're in second or sixth, you're going to click on that second copy there. Going backwards then to my agenda. What I did here is I'm giving you some quotes that you can use for your questions. So let's take a look at the questions. And now that you've taken that practice test, some of these questions will sound familiar to you. So in the story, Brock often is checking his scanner to identify feelings such as being hot and emotions such as loneliness. What conclusion can you draw about the environment and the people inside the dome based on Brock's need to constantly check his scanner while outside the dome? So we know from the test now that the people inside, the real answer to that is the people inside the dome weren't used to these extreme environments because they probably didn't have anything like weather because it was all controlled. Now, possible quotes you could use to show that these people probably wouldn't recognize outside weather is this one from paragraph 5. Are you wearing the prescribed dry suit with helmet and gloves? Says the person, the character in the story before Brock goes outside. Why are they asking him that? Because they're not sure what the outside weather is going to be like. They're not used to those extremes. They're not sure if it's safe. Inside, it's all protected. And then the character later says, remember to drink sparingly. Water supply is limited. So that tells us something about life inside the dome. Or this one here. These are all quotes that you can use for the letter C when you're doing your ACEs. People used to go outside, but the outside environment was threatening. So hardly anyone ever used it now. I don't know if I had that quote right. I'll have to check that from paragraph 14. I may have written that wrong. So hardly anyone ever used it now. I'll have to look and check on that one. But again, people just hadn't been outside for a long time, and that's what that quote is saying right there. So let's go to number 2, and we'll talk a little bit more about these on Monday, and I'll check that quote. But let's go to number 2. What causes Brock to take a trip outside the dome, and ultimately, what effects does going outside the dome? Effects does going outside the dome have on Brock? So, focusing on that first part, what causes him to take a trip outside the dome? Well, here's some possible quotes from paragraph 17. Perhaps once he had realized the danger of the ancient fictions posed, he should have left them alone. So he went into these stories called the ancient fictions. But these ancient fictions, it says here, they made him feel hollow, hungry for something no food pellet or even virtual experience could satisfy. So what the story tells us is that Brock had read these ancient fictions, these stories from the past, from people when they used to live out in the outside world. And that made him feel hollow, empty about his world inside the dome, and hungry for something outside the dome that none of these food pellets that they were using to give themselves for efficiency rather than making big meals, none of these food pellets or even virtual experiences could satisfy what he wanted. He wanted a taste of the real world. So the second part of the question is, what effects does going outside the dome have on Brock? Well, of course, Brock could never be the same anymore. He had experienced something different, and he wanted more after that. Let's go to question number 3. Why do people inside the dome believe that trees and dogs are extinct? and that the air and the water outside the dome are poisonous. Well, here's a quote from paragraph 32. But but now dogs were extinct. They were gone dark. They'd gone dark during the dark ages when the atmosphere had become warm and poisonous. So it tells us there that something had happened. In fact, in the story, it talks about that apparently the atmosphere had become warm and poisonous, like it says here, and people began to go inside the dome. Those who could, those who wanted to, and those who could afford to. The story kind of indicates that those who didn't have enough wealth were forced to stay outside the dome. They then had to somehow try to survive, but the atmosphere continued to grow warm and poisonous, and they ended up eating all the remaining animals until both animals and people died and were gone. That's what they believed had happened. Of course, we know now that not all the dogs were extinct. So what they believed had happened maybe didn't necessarily completely take place. So it's a really interesting kind of a part of the story. So we'll maybe look at that more on Monday. Now, the next and last question. When Brock realizes that this environment outside the dome is not dangerous, he says, could it be that fear kept the dome dwellers prisoner many years longer than a poisoned environment would have? What theme does this suggest? And I thought the theme was something like fear often keeps us from doing anything. Fear is a horrible emotion. Fear is something that it immobilizes us. It keeps us from doing anything. And so they were so afraid that they'd gone inside the dome. Remember, they thought that all the people had died, all the dogs were gone, but that didn't happen. And inside the dome, they became prisoners of this limited world, right? They could only have so much experience inside of a dome. They had to do everything virtually, which would be, we can identify, we had to do everything virtually last year. So fear kept them inside this dome, but maybe if they had stayed outside, they would have had seen that the earth was healing itself. And that's exactly what the quote is. Could they be wrong? Could the outside world have healed itself? And so if they had maybe seen it through, worked together, maybe they could have been a part of that healing. And, inside the dome, maybe they were experiencing more. Being a prisoner of that was worse than living through the poison environment, healing the poison environment. And maybe that was a lesser poison than living inside the dome. And hopefully some of that makes sense. So, all right, that's it. I've done enough talking. You guys will have a chance to do some other things. The substitute will explain that to you. And have a great weekend, and I'll see you on Monday.